Hey guys, and welcome to the end. This has been a long time coming. We've spent, better part of a year and a half or maybe even more on the Xenoverse, Xenogears, Xenosaga 1 through 3. This was a massive undertaking, and I figured it was probably due since, it's a 3-part game, and I've done my individual reviews of each game, even though with episodes 2 and 3 I kind of made comparisons and contrasts. I figured it was good to kind of review the entire series as a whole. I'm going to throw a bit of Xenogears in there as well, just because it goes along with it, and one of the questions I want to answer is, well, is Xenosaga a good continuation, a good successor to Xenogears, which was such a cult classic? Now, to start off, I just want to tell you, this has been the biggest undertaking I've ever had to do as far as my Let's Playing has gone. I devoted a lot of time to research. You wouldn't believe, just for the previous 4 episodes that I cut up in the database, I spent 4 hours prior to that doing research. 4 hours. And that was only that 4 hours. It took me 2 hours to record that hour and a half or whatever it was worth of 4 episodes. But I've spent a lot of time on this trying to understand the plot so as I can best explain it so I'm not stumbling over my words too much, which of course you know me, I do anyway. But I've put a lot of effort into it, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. A lot of people, they look at games like Xenosaga Episode 1 and they don't want to do a Let's Play of it because it's not a Let's Play, it's a Let's Watch. And I've heard that explanation before, and for the first little bit when I was thinking about it, I agreed with it. I was like, oh, how am I going to do anything with that? But I forgot at the time, since it'd been probably 10 years since I had played any of the Xenosaga games, that those games are really interesting, and there's a lot to talk about, specifically when it comes to things like the database, the mythology, and all that. So I could do something very similar to what I did with Xenogears with it, and so I decided to undertake the whole series. Now, we ran into a bit of stumbling blocks with Episode 3 and the recording process and having issues, and eventually I just started ignoring them because having one light issue was better than changing settings all the time, and it just ended up working out better, at least on my end. Personally, the lighting change doesn't really bother me all that much. It's annoying in a couple of situations, but other than that, I can usually deal with it. But yeah, this has taken a long time to do, and I'm glad that, that I was able to put all that effort into it, because I'm really proud of what I was able to do. I was able to explain things in a way that I hope is at least understandable to someone who hasn't spent all the time researching that I have. So hopefully I was able to do that, and thank you guys for sticking around for the entire series. It's been a long time. Considering that, it's time to move on to something a little bit lighter. In fact, this episode, based on what all things that I have recorded, should come out on a Thursday, presumably. And from there, Friday will be off. I won't be recording anything, and I may take a week off after that, depending on when I get back from my trip. It just kind of depends. I'm not sure where I'll be, which is why so much of this got recorded ahead of time. But if you think about it, I've spent a lot of time critiquing this series, and there's a specific reason for that. I love the series. And if I'm not able to critique and criticize something I love for doing something wrong, then I'm just fanboying it. And I would much rather over-critique and nitpick things as opposed to just say, oh, this is so epic, so awesome, and then not acknowledge the complaints. I most definitely do that. This is such an epic reveal for Wilhelm, or the albedo scene with Momo in Episode 1 it literally was an awesome scene, but in order to give it the right context, I basically shut up and just kind of pointed a couple of things out. There's a lot of scenes in Episode 3 that are just so packed with information that it made more sense for me to shut up and let them kind of play out for the most part, which is why I was a little more quiet during some of the latter half of the game cutscenes. I wanted to get the emotion of the scenes across without being, you know, too kind of invested in talking about it as it was happening, and then hopefully find some quiet points beyond that to kind of address certain issues that I have. But it's a really great series, and if I wasn't able to properly convey that because of all my bitching, I want to at least clarify here that I do love the series. It is an awesome series. Now, that moves us into kind of my series review. I'm just going to take like something like graphics and apply it to all of them and just kind of do a little mini analysis of each of them, and then say what I liked, what I didn't like, and which one probably did it best. For these, I will be including Xenogears, but if my favorite was Xenogears, then I will let you know what my favorite was in the Xenosaga trilogy. As far as graphics go, I've made it clear that I like the graphical style of Episode 1 the best, but at the same time, like Xenosaga 2, I didn't like the graphical style. I found the faces kind of looked weird and elongated, and they were going for a more realistic style, which is fine, and it directed the series toward Episode 3, which I think did it better. But I think Episode 2, as far as the character sprites, was a misstep as far as the overall animation of, you know, buildings and all that stuff. It's an upgrade, and then Episode 3 is an upgrade beyond that. Xenogears, even for the time, the graphics aren't all that great. The cutscene cinematics in, you know, anime style, that was fine, but for the most part, I was not a big fan of the graphical style of that game. So in the end, due to things like, I don't know, like, so reddening of the eyes, character emotions on the faces, basically the whole drawing style in general, Episode 3, as the most recent one, makes the most sense as being the best, and I think objectively it is. I still personally prefer Episode 1, but there we are. Now, gameplay for the whole series, I'm just going to look at things that are gameplay that aren't battle related. Or aren't the battle system. So we're not talking about, you know, equipping our characters, we're not talking about skill progression and stuff like that. We're talking about mini games, how the characters moved, how we progress through the games with like little puzzles and stuff like that. And when you look at it that way, Episode 1 had the email system and then a couple of stupid minigames, which really weren't all that important to do. Episode 2 was mostly minigames and other stuff. Now, admittedly, the minigames in Episode 2 are fine. In fact, most of them are pretty generic and not difficult. They're pretty straightforward. You can get them all done. It's just that there's too many of them. That's the biggest downside to the gameplay in Episode 2, is it's not focused on the plot enough. You know, we have, what, 3 or 4 post-game dungeons. Why do we have 3 or 4 post-game dungeons when the game itself is so short? You know, if you take those post-game dungeons out, you take out all the side events, you have a 20-hour game that follows a 40-hour game previously and moves on to like a 60-hour game in Episode 3. Episode 3, other than Haycock's, pretty much all the other puzzles were not too bad, and most of the gameplay is fun to an extent. Overall, I personally like the simplicity and the lack of going back and doing backtracking and stuff like that that we got from Episode 1. So I'm going to give the edge to Episode 1. Xenogears, as far as gameplay goes, it's fine. As far as the camera controls go, that's probably the biggest issue for me in Episode 1, or in Xenogears, sorry. So that kind of loses it out on the running there. The battle system. I like the Xenogears battle system. Honestly, I like the battle system to an extent for all of the games, but Xenogears was more simplistic. It wasn't necessarily the most balanced. Personally, I like it the most. If you want to look at how it's balanced and how characters are useful in specific situations, Xenosaga Episode 3 wins out hands down. Xenosaga Episode 3, the combat has been refined so much, and it's so much more balanced than it was before, because in Episode 1, basically, you know, you had one character that was good against one type of enemy, usually. But you never knew that until you checked out guides. And that is, I think, kind of a failing of the game. You don't know what's weak against what. So that kind of draws that one down to me. So out of all three of them, you know, the battle system for 2 is just, it takes too long. You know, it takes too long in all three of the games. Xenogears is the one that it really doesn't take too long to complete battles in, which is one of the big reasons why it wins out. But with the battle system in episode 2, it really is long, and without a guide, you're basically screwed on that one. So because of the simplicity of it and the speed, if I was to choose a Xenosaga game as opposed to Xenogears for the battle system, I would go with episode 3. The voice acting. Now, the voice acting I've talked about to death because I personally love voice acting. I'm one of those people who will watch the dub if it's available in anime, video games, whatever it is. That's not to say I don't like subs. I've watched a lot of subs too, and a lot of them I usually like a lot. In fact, if I watch a sub before a dub, depending on how it is, I often will prefer the sub. But that doesn't change the fact that a good dubbed, English dubbed voice acting anime, video game, whatever, will allow me to focus more on what's going around the screen, characters, actions, stuff like that, and I'm not reading text. And it allows the character to add additional emotion that is easier for an English-speaking person to pick up. So that's why I love dubs. And as far as the entire series goes, episode 1, hands down. They cut half the people for episode 2. A few came back for episode 3 and put in great performances, but half, you know, a quarter of them are still missing. So in the end, like, Xenogears had horrible voice acting. Let's be honest here. So episode wins that hands down. They also win as far as characters go, because the character building in episode 1 is perfect. All the characters get built up, but nothing really happens as far as plot goes, which is why I think the character building is basically the point of the game. So if they didn't win, there'd be some issues there. Now, the characterization of certain characters gets changed without explanation in episode 2. And then in episode 3, characterization gets changed with an implied idea. You know, the reason for Shion's change in episode 2 gets revealed. Junior's becomes kind of stupid, and that's never really explained. But regardless of that, episode 1, that game was designed on building characters more so than advancing the plot as a whole, and so it definitely wins out in my eyes. As far as the story goes, you have to give that to episode 3. You do. There's no way around that. The story, plot holes aside, or plot holes included if you want, the amount that happens in episode 3 is intense. There are so many epic scenes. We learn so much about characters: Chaos, Wilhelm, KOS-MOS, Shion, everything. Well, they say everything gets tied up. Not everything gets tied up. The amount of research that I did is very limited in the grand scheme of things. People have taken both Xenosaga and Xenogears and written university papers on this stuff. There is so much here to unpack, to explain, to explore. But as far as story goes, you know, episode 2 is so short that it really gets cut out of the running. Xenogears is a close second, I would say, because it's a more complete experience as opposed to, say, episode 1 or 2, which are very much standalone. Episode 3 kind of culminates what happens in episode 1 and 2, and culminates other things like Pied Piper and other stories that don't get their own game. So Xenosaga episode 3 wins, hands down, easy. Finally, we have music. Now, my second favorite soundtrack in video games of all time is Xenogears, so that should tell you where that one lands on this list. Xenogears is easily my favorite soundtrack. Mitsuda is insanely good when it comes to creating atmospheric music for specific scenes. Just look at episode 1 for an example. Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, the best soundtrack of all time, and of course Xenogears. If I had to do a second place, I would go Xenosaga Episode 1, just because Xenosaga Episode 1, with things like albedo, the final battle, all the tension building scenes, that's where it is. In episode 3, the soundtrack is awesome. And if you kind of look at it in terms of repetition, though, episode 1 had a lot of silence. Episode 3 probably had too much repetition, too many songs being used in too many different places, and too many variants on the same piece of music. That being said, if you want something to listen to outside of the game, episode 2 has, the best music in the series. I've already kind of talked about this. But I'd say Xenogears has the best soundtrack of the 4 games, and Xenosaga Episode 1 would be my close second. Now, considering that we've talked about Xenosaga and Xenogears, let's contrast the two. There was a bunch of information between the 2 games that was kind of a callback in Xenosaga to Xenogears. Things like the Zohar. The Zohar was in both games. It makes perfect sense that it basically does the same thing. It's a connection unit to go to the higher dimension in both games and connects to the wave existence and then to Udu. So it basically connects to the higher existence, higher realm. It connects to God. It has the same purpose. We just know... Well, the thing is, in Xenosaga, it's brought up right away, and in Xenogears, we only find it at the end, or toward the end of the game. Which is fine, I guess, but it's just kind of, there's the similarities and there's the differences of the same idea. And you can look at a lot of characters. There's a lot of characters that have echoes and relations to other characters, from Xenogears to Xenosaga. Miang and Wilhelm, your 2 primary villains in each game, those 2 have very similar agendas. They are trying to wipe out the planet or in Wilhelm's case, the universe, in different ways for different purposes. Miang's trying to revive Deus, and Wilhelm's trying to start things over from scratch. Each of them are trying to go back to something that was set up long before, as of course Deus was created in the past of the current timeline in Xenogears. Characters like Jin and Satan, or Satan and KOS-MOS as the protector characters. Jin and Satan, for obvious reasons, they have similar looks, similar names, similar fighting styles, etc. They both seem to know more about what's going on than they reveal it at any one time. We don't have the swerve with Jin as we did with Satan, but that's all right. The ES names are the same names as we had on the Anima Relics, as the ESs are named after the Vessels of Anima, so that makes perfect sense. We see Abel closely tied to God in both games, where in Xenogears he's contacted or talked to or looked at by basically God through the Zohar wave existence, and that creates kind of the template for humanity going forward right from the start of the game, where of course here it's an after image or a projection of Udu. Nephilim and Ellie kind of align together, not only in terms of looks and the cross and all that kind of stuff, but they have similar character archetypes. In fact, I don't have his name offhand, but I'll try and remember to pop it on screen. One of my viewers was nice enough to give me a link to like a zip file with a collection from a website that's been down for quite some time. And in that, there were someone made a translation of these character archetypes and personality analysis on each of the characters from Xenosaga, which was rather interesting. They also included kind of connections back to Xenogears there as well. So that was pretty interesting. I didn't go too deeply into the analysis, because really to understand a lot of the personality traits, you need to have an understanding of more psychology than my college career was able to provide me. I got tired of spending way too long studying for, abnormal psychology exams. Studying for 2 days straight for that one. Anyway, Shion, you can look at Shion and Faye. They both share, the protagonist role. They both unknowingly are basically attacking people in the world. Shion with the summoning of Gnosis, and Faye with his id persona. And what else we got here? We got Junior, the Junior Albedo kind of parallel, you know, the two halves of the same thing as their conjoined twins. And then Faye and Id, you can kind of see a parallel there as well, which is also pretty cool. And of course, the ESs are basically just like the Omni Gears, very much of the series. You could run through stuff like this all day. It's the same creator, the same story designer started Xenosaga as well as worked on Xenogears, so there's a lot of reason for that. Many of the personnel came over, at least as far as the story development and the art designers and stuff like that. Considering that Xenogears was such a you know, kind of like a cult classic with all its religious imagery and mythology and stuff like that, Xenosaga has also done that, and some people have talked about it as being too in your face. The imagery is too in your face. It's not subtle enough. It's hard to enjoy it that way. And from like a professional critiquer, reviewer, you know, someone who's paid to do this, that is kind of the standard. Subtlety is better. But does that hamper my ability to enjoy the series? Fuck no! In no way does it prevent me from enjoying the series. I love the series for all that it does. My neuroses with certain problems aside, you know, I can deal with those. They annoy me, but if I get far enough into the storyline, I can be completely invested. There's 3 or 4 scenes in the ending cinematics that can half the time bring tears to my eyes just watching them, because you can get easily so invested in these characters, the emotion of the scene, the music, the voice acting, everything is excellent. So, does it hamper my ability to enjoy it? No. And I don't think that should be considered a proper criticism of the game if it's not going to harm your ability to enjoy it. If it does harm it, that's a personal perspective. By all means, that works for you. For me personally, it doesn't bug me. But, like I said, Xenogears is this classic, cult classic game, and everyone loved it. And when it was announced that Xenosaga, spiritual successor with the same creator, was coming to PS2, everyone was alight with joy, and it's like, hey, we're finally going to get this, you know, the whole idea as he originally wanted it. And of course we didn't, because he ran into the same problems. But is Xenosaga a worthy successor to Xenogears? Yes. They have many similar aspects, you know, the narrative in both kind of, even though the specifics are different, the overall ideas are very similar. They play around with a lot of stuff like that. Similar character archetypes, similar character personalities, ideas, dynamics between characters. Lots of stuff has been brought over. They still suffer from, basically both suffer from the same problems. You know, Xenogears and Xenosaga, they both tend to be way too confusing. Episode 2 is better than the others, but the whole series in general is very confusing, which is why I've spent so much time researching it to try and make sense of it and to explain that to everyone else. There are too many plot holes in both. Xenogears has its plot holes. Xenosaga, I've talked about them immensely. They have their plot holes. Does it really hurt them in general? Yeah, a little, but at the same time, if you can still enjoy the storylines with those plot holes in there, like I can, and I'm sure many other people can, then you've done something right. And finally, they both lost the funding, like I mentioned before, that they originally wanted. And without that, we never will get the final story that they wanted to tell. Now, admittedly, the Xenoverse has been kind of revived with Xenoblade and Xenoblade Chronicles X. I have no intentions of doing an LP for either game. I have watched an LP for Xenoblade Chronicles. Xenoblade Chronicles X, I've seen about 2 minutes of footage from, and that's about it. I really have no interest in it. The battle system for Xenoblade is something that I'm not particularly a fan of, though between the voice acting, the alright music, it's nothing outstanding, but it's alright. The characters, which are awesome, the storyline in general, it's all great. I really love it. There are a lot of callbacks in Xenoblade to Xenosaga and Xenogears, but it doesn't really follow the same archetypal story and the same kind of trying to retell the same ideas that they did with something like Xenosaga. So it's not something that I feel is super connected to the 4 games that I've already done. And because of that, and because I don't have the consoles, I won't be playing those games. That's pretty much it. I really wanted to kind of give everyone a final send-off for this series. It's been a long time in the work. I've spent a lot of hours on it. I've enjoyed it. I've been annoyed by it. I've enjoyed it some more. And yeah, that's pretty much all for Let's Play Xenosaga. And Let's Play the Xenoverse, if you want to consider it that way. Anyway, that's all for this one. And I'll see you guys for what comes next.